Okay, thank you all for coming. If one of the other co-hosts can continue to admit people from the waiting room while I'm talking, that would be great. I'm sure some people will still trickle in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first symposium of the Black Sheep Society. My name is Renny Hahamovitch, and I'll be emceeing today's exciting event. For those of you who don't already know, the BSS is a recently founded group of leftist academics and intellectuals who study REEES. We are a big tent leftist group open to anyone on the left interested in grappling with the complex legacies of socialism and the realities of post-socialism in the region. We also help to build solidarity between each other as academic workers and aid ongoing and burgeoning labor struggles among graduate students and faculty. If you're interested in joining, please reach out to me or to one of the other panelists today, or sign up on our listserv using the form, which my comrade Zach will drop in the chat. Now, we live in interesting times. The decades of global austerity have instigated a new generation of the left with lots of exciting ideas, reopening old political fissures and calling into question orthodoxies long thought settled. Of course, while the presence of that new wave of the left is undoubtable, it is not entirely novel. This meeting is only possible because of the pioneering work of many other older lefter scholars who have come before us, who have been challenging the liberal hegemonies of the field for decades, giving us the key tools, perspectives, and arguments, which now we hope to build as a revived movement. Some of those veterans of the academic left we hope are here today, and we will hear from some of them directly in our upcoming symposium on April 5th, which you'll all be hearing more about soon. While this new left in recent years has begun to seriously penetrate academia and intellectual life in general, we, as scholars of Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and the formerly socialist world, find ourselves in a field that is still a major bulwark of anti-socialism and reactionary thought. Sometimes, while sitting in conferences or reading academic journals, it feels as if the Cold War never ended, or perhaps even restarted. The specter of socialism still haunts us. The legacies of that socialism are complex, ambiguous, and contested, but offer important and necessary insights for any socialism of the future. Today, our task is not to banish that ghost, but to discuss how to bring it back into corporeal form. We're going to hear from 5 BSS members representing various disciplines who will collectively try to lay some groundwork for the future interventions by the left, thinking through the gaps, oversights, and opportunities in the fields that face us. Of course, it's important to acknowledge the limitations of our perspectives. All of our panelists today are situated within the North American Academy. I, like many others in the BSS, though not necessarily on this panel, am also from the United States, and thus a foreigner to the region and to the realities of socialist and post-socialist life. Many disciplines, regions, and identities are also unrepresented here, but very much should be. Our perspectives are provisional and cautious, and certainly not universal. We hope to have many future events in which we hear from a greater diversity of participants, and we encourage any and all who are interested in doing so to reach out to us and to create those opportunities for further collaboration. Our format today will be action-packed, but hopefully with plenty of time for discussion at the end. Each of the speakers on our roundtable will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, after which I will invite the audience to participate in a broader discussion. During the roundtable, you are encouraged to put questions and comments in the chat, but we'll leave the discussion itself at the end. Now, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Rossen Djagalov teaches Soviet and post-Soviet culture at NYU. He's an editor of Leftist, a member of the DSA, and author of From Internationalism to Postcolonialism, Literature and Cinema Between the Second and Third World, not the Third World War. His upcoming book is entitled Friendship of the Peoples, The Rise and Fall of Multinational Soviet Literature. Rossen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Renny. Thank you, and great to see you all. So I'm going to start a bit in media res, since my favorite panel at last year's Socialism or Barbarism series was the graduate student labor roundtable. But there was one thing in particular about it that struck me, a certain discrepancy between most participants' activism in the campus unionization campaigns and the not obviously political dissertation topics that most presenters mentioned. Of course, that much a dissertation title can convey, and it's absolutely not necessary for one's scholarship to be aligned in any way with one's politics. One should be writing the kind of dissertation one is interested in, politics or not. But in a sense, we don't have a choice, whether we want it or not. In my field, at least, and let's call it Soviet literature and culture, we are already politicized. Unlike anthropology, which reached our region only after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, or history, which had gone through revisionism and a lot of intellectual ground clearing, the field of 20th century literature and culture already has the Cold War written all over it and in capital letters. Many of our senior colleagues are still fighting communism long after it's gone, and so it's a good deal of the scholarship we have to teach and cite. So, with the task of stating the obvious, the discipline is not neutral. There are ideological force fields in it, sometimes more visible, sometimes less, that force us to ask certain research questions or come to certain conclusions, and we should, as a minimum, be aware of them. So let me spend the remaining 4 or 5 minutes accounting for the particular force field I've experienced, namely that of the post-Soviet Russian, and more broadly post-socialist intelligentsias, then posit the importance of treating those intelligentsias not as the ultimate authority on the state socialist experience, but rather as an object of study, and finally, advocate for the comparative method as a way of avoiding the intelligentsia's force field. But let me start a little autobiographical with the 1990s, which found my family, like most Bulgarian families, on a socially and economically downward trajectory. Nostalgia was the main idiom in which they expressed their protest against the transition to capitalism, and words, and of course, words like neoliberalism were not part of their vocabulary, nor are they now. So from very early on, and not particularly consciously, I was inclined to identify with this perspective. And yet my formative intellectual experience was as a starstruck visiting student at Moscow's Russian State University for the Humanities in the early 2000s, which at the time was the hotbed of the Yeltsin intelligentsia. Nostalgia was treated as a pathology there. The main narrative of Soviet literature I inherited was an ego narrative of the intelligentsia as the main hero and victim of the repressive regime. I had teachers like Boris Dubin and Lev Gutkov, the heads of the famous Levada Center, who taught us all about the Sovietsky простой человек, the Homo Sovieticus, the figure standing in the way of former state socialist society's westernization and democratic development. Speaking with hindsight, I'm a little horrified by how this theory dehumanized my family and really most of the populations of the former Soviet bloc. But Dubin and Gutkov were brilliant lecturers, and at the time I believe nobody understood the Soviet Union or Russia better than them. It was only very slowly over the course of my doctoral studies that I began to reflect on these narratives, on the narratives I've inherited in Moscow, and eventually wrote my own declaration of intellectual independence from them in the form of an article on the anti-populism of the mainstream late and post-socialist intelligentsia, which I then followed up with another piece on the racism of the liberal intelligentsia. There are other features of the political style of the contemporary intelligentsias, such as their anti-utopianism, the belief that any conscious attempt to radically reform society in the name of social justice necessarily leads to Stalin-Berry and Gulag. And those still shape our scholarly narratives, and those are still yet to be interrogated. There are also many other scholarly projects that thinking of the intelligentsia in class terms can help us formulate. One, for example, is the role of intelligentsia culture in the decomposition, the role of cultural producers in the decomposition of the working classes in the late and post-Soviet period, that is, in the loss of working class subjectivity. Or conversely, in the formation of the working class as a political subject in the late 19th or early 20th century, or the role of various forms, genres, and media of Soviet culture or socialist realism vis-a-vis proletarian or peasant audiences. And of course, to do so while retaining a critical perspective on the Soviet Union. Should anybody pick up that line of scholarship, they would be doing God's work. And finally, and with this I'll end, as somebody who's worked on Soviet Third World literary and cinematic engagements, and who still is trying to situate Soviet literature within world literature, I probably have to make a plug for the value of the comparative method in the study of Soviet and state socialist culture, society, and political economy, It is a very trite and obvious point, but it is so much easier to pathologize the Soviet experience when looking upon it in isolation, on the terms offered to us by the late and post-socialist intelligentsia. And with this, I hand back the baton to Renny.
Thank you, Rossen. That was really wonderful. Okay, our next speaker is Olena Lyubchenko. She's a PhD candidate in political science at York University and an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Her research and teaching focuses on the political economy of the Soviet Union in a global context and on primitive accumulation and social reproduction in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine. Olena is an editor at Leftist and an affiliate with the Alameda Institute. Olena, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So unlike most of you, probably, I am not from the field of what has been referred to as Slavic, Eastern European, Eurasian, or sometimes Russian studies. Coming from York University in Toronto, political science department, known for its Marxist and Marxist feminist political economy approaches. I'm proud to say that during my coursework, I received very good education in the tradition of critique of political economy. However, our study of the socialist and the post-socialist region in the graduate core courses was almost non-existent or very narrow. It either ended in 1924 or began in 1991. And York is a politicized space, right? Lots of labor organizing and activism. And as I'm speaking to you right now, there's a strike at York University by graduate workers, graduate students, and contract faculty for higher wages, among other things. So our solidarity with them. But coming back to my talk, so for a student like myself, coming from a working class, first generation immigrant background from post-Soviet Ukraine and out of all places, kind of nostalgic, Soviet nostalgic region of Donbass, it felt one-sided and I didn't fully see myself like in the curriculum, right? And so I was very happy to find friends and collaborators and comrades in the socialism or barbarism stream at ACES and ACES in general. But I found this space to be one-sided also. While literature and cultural studies and history was allowed to be critical, political science, political economy was not really there, right? With some very, of course, important exceptions who are present today on the Zoom. It almost seemed as if critical leftist reevaluation of socialist and post-socialist experience was only allowed as a cultural or a historical analysis. The kind of harder discipline, like political science, I'm laughing at harder discipline, but political science or political economy was almost too much or too suspicious. As if you could only bring politics and socialist politics in, not through the door, but through the window. So while in the most kind of Marxist and Hegelian of ways, we must not separate culture from politics, there's something telling about a lack of leftist social scientists in Eastern European, Eurasian, Slavic studies with a focus on post-socialist region. So my hope for Black Sheep society is that among other beautiful, wonderful objectives that Renny and Rossen have already mentioned, that it can foster an environment where young students and scholars of social sciences, such as political science and specifically political economy, can find a place for their research and collaboration. But also where doing a political economy analysis of the socialist and post-socialist region is not left to kind of liberal hot takes and tropes about authoritarianism, path dependency, or democratization, and so on, which really take up most of the space, especially in light of Russia's war in Ukraine now. But rather that we can take that space back for production of knowledge on big picture questions of political transformation, including, using quantitative methods even from a leftist perspective. So bringing critical political science and critique of political economy within Black Sheep and therefore within the Slavic, Eastern European, Eurasian studies would not just deal with or be concerned with legacies of socialism, as Renny mentioned, but also with its futures, right? In thinking in terms of policy alternatives. And in this way, critical scholars of political economy, hopefully studying, capitalist transformation, neoliberal reforms, inequality, social policy, and so on, can serve as a way of bringing the field of Slavic, Eastern European, Eurasian studies in conversation with new debates in political science, political economy, political theory. And here I can highlight, for instance, social reproduction feminism, social reproduction theory, especially primitive accumulation scholarship, but also law, socio-legal studies, and also can bring us to current political struggles, such as land back movements, anti-colonial struggles, labor movements, and more. So really bridging the gap between scholarly work and work, and as Renny mentioned, academic workers and ongoing labor struggles, right, among graduate students and faculty, but not just stopping at concerns with academic labor or labor defined as waged labor, but moving towards political struggles also on social reproduction, increased cost of living, resource extraction, crisis of care, militarization, police violence, among other ongoing issues globally. So production of knowledge on political struggles around social reproduction in socialist and post-socialist region, this would be a very good thing that Black Sheep could facilitate. And who, if not us, should build on the legacies, the contradictions, and sometimes the unfulfilled promises and, thwarted promises of Soviet and socialist policymakers in the early and long 20th century. Thank you, and Renny, back to you.
Thank you so much, Elena. Okay, our next speaker is Ilya Kliger. He teaches literature at the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies at NYU, also with Rossen. He's author of The Narrative Shape of Truth, Veridiction in Modern European Literature, and co-author with Boris Maslov of Persistent Forms, Practicing Historical Poetics. His interests lie primarily in the fields of realist fiction and critical theory. Ilya, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Renny and Rossen and Elena. That was really amazing. I guess my task, as I understand it, is to try to begin the conversation about the sort of work that can be done within and is already being done within the leftist political orientation in the field of Russian and Slavic literary study specifically. And with this in mind, I would like to zero in on one issue in particular around which a lot of disciplinary tensions have historically unfolded, namely the question of the relationship between theory and history. Historically, or at least chronologically, this tension has played out as a turn, no longer so recent, away from a certain kind of theory to a certain kind of history. And I emphasize kind here because it seems to me that both paradigms, the supposedly old theory and the supposedly new history, appear abstract in their attempt to ground themselves in opposition to each other. The kind of theory that defines itself as a way of knowing outside or beyond history, while the kind of history that resists being grounded theoretically. I think that in resisting each other, both sides of the tension also come to resist politics, understood as the politics of the present, of the critical act. So to be a little bit more specific, what I mean by theory in its one-sided manifestation, and a manifestation that is important for our field, is a practice attempting to grasp the nature of the literary text as an object or a process in possession of a kind of intrinsic essence, the literary as such, or literariness. Best case scenario, in my view at least, such an essence has been understood as inhering in the highly organized character of literary use of language, as a function of which literary texts are deemed capable of storing great amounts of information about historically concrete as well as transhistorical experience. When it comes to the sort of literary theory that had gained most currency in Russian literary studies, at least in the West, these tended to be drawn from Soviet sources, but treated as a priori dissident, which is to say, as produced explicitly in opposition to a certain construal of official Soviet scholarship with its sociological, political, and otherwise unacceptably extrinsic bias. I'm thinking here of three paradigms in particular: Russian formalism, the Tartu-Moscow School of Semiotics, and the corpus of texts associated with the figure of Mikhail Bakhtin. Under the influence of the historical turn, more recent scholarship on these figures has been less interested in explicating the theories themselves than in restoring the rich ideological backgrounds in which these corpuses of theory developed, including their roots in the democratic, populist, revolutionary, and anti-capitalist traditions. But what seems to me to happen here, in a way that I think is symptomatic, is a kind of relegation of theory to the treasury of historical curiosities, towards which we can now safely adopt a contemplative stance. What results, in other words, is a kind of historicist neutralization of the subject matter, in which the procedure of historicization emerges as structurally, if not intentionally, condescending. To step away from literary theory and to put on my 19th centuryist hat back for a moment, we are familiar with numerous similar exercises when it comes to studies of 19th century revolutionary movements in the Russian Empire. If we are so eager to establish contemplative distance between ourselves and that world, with its much more vivid utopian imagination and much more open historical horizons than our own, then perhaps this tells us something rather dreary about ourselves. This takes me then more broadly to the historical turn in literary scholarship. The many achievements of this development are undeniable, ranging from canon criticism to painstaking positioning of literary texts in the field of neighboring discourses, medical, legal, economic, political, theological, and so on. What seems to me to be missing, at least tendentially, from such work is the recognition of the need for theoretical clarity about what we mean by history. From this perspective, the literary theoretical projects I have mentioned actually sometimes offer more than their historical counterparts for conceptual reflection on history, frequently echoing or explicitly invoking models of historical movement that emerge out of Marx and the Marxist tradition. That tradition offers us a large number of highly generative and mutually complementary approaches, whether these involve the conception of history as class struggle, as reorganization within modes of production, as evolving world systems, uneven developments, conjunctural overdeterminations, and so on. I don't mean to say that these are to be taken by literary history as ready-made solutions, but rather as frameworks for continued reflection within which the project of literary history and theory, the project of literary history and theory construed as a leftist project seems to me to remain insufficiently grounded. I'm aware of several projects taking the form of both single author and collective publications, as well as reading groups, that among other things attempt to work through this mutual resistance of history and theory, as well as to foreground the historicity of that resistance itself. I want to just mention very briefly two of them: a working group on democratic populism, currently on break, but hopefully soon to resume, exploring texts in 19th century populist, anarchist, and Marxist traditions within the Russian Empire, in part in order to resist the historicist neutralization of these traditions in mainstream scholarship, and with particular focus on interclass dynamics, which continue to preoccupy us today. And second project that I wanted to mention is a working group exploring world systems theory as a framework for conceptualizing the place of literary production within specific political economic configurations. A number of panels proposed at the next ACES within the Black Sheep Left Perspectives stream appear to be at least in part dedicated to working through this history-theory divide. I'm sure more like-minded projects are underway, and I think it would be great to coordinate our efforts in this direction under the goofy leftist banner of the Black Sheep. Let's bring back the ghost.
Thank you so much, Ilya. As one of these historians that has a extremely casual grasp on a theory of these, is extremely instructive for me. Okay, our next speaker is Elena Razlogova. She teaches transnational media history at Concordia University in Montreal. She's the author of The Listener's Voice, Early Radio with the American Public, and various articles on cinematic diplomacy in the era of the Cold War and decolonization. Her work considers the political economy of culture in comparative and transnational perspectives. Elena, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. So as everybody else, I would like to say a few things about myself first. I was born in Moscow and was trained as an American historian and a cultural studies scholar in the United States, but I'm now teaching in Montreal, Canada. And now I'm also working on socialist Global South cinematic contacts during decolonization and the Cold War, and continuing my work on American radio and American music industry. So today I'm speaking more from my perspective as an Americanist and historian of a global Cold War rather than a historian of any socialist country, even though I'm coming from one. And this perspective is relevant to this audience specifically because ACES operates in the context of American Academy and therefore depends on American politics in the Academy and at large. And I think the Black Sheep could do a few things in this regard, it both in kind of transforming the role of Soviet and socialist history in American culture and at large, and also on battling some of the tendencies with this within Cold War socialist history by drawing on Soviet internationalism and third world Marxist theories and traditions. So one thing that's different about the historical profession than some other disciplines is that historians sometimes write best-selling books. And I think even though they may not be as involved in theory, they are important in the culture at large. And I think it's important to counter best-selling histories of the Soviet Union that promote neoliberalism by defining Soviet-style state socialism as an archetypal tyranny. And this is, I know it's an old strategy and boring to talk about, but it is ascendant because of Russian invasion of Ukraine currently, which gave an opportunity to scholars like Anne Applebaum and Timothy Schneider to proclaim the new Cold War, and the concept reiterates their Manichaean views and also conflates capitalist Russia of today with the Soviet Union of yesterday. And I think expanding the view beyond the two powers in the Cold War context and in general to the rest of the world would be really beneficial in thinking about any aspect of American or socialist Eastern European history in terms of Marxist writings by anti-colonial scholars such as Cedric Robinson, and also applying ideas of anti-colonial thinkers such as the ones discussed in Adam Gatichew's book, World Making After Empire. The other thing that I think needs to be done is a critique of Soviet and socialist histories that are well done and respected in the profession but in fact are apolitical and therefore implicitly liberal. And I'm using just one example here, not because I think it's the worst one, but because it came up during the discussion after the article in Leftist was published by Alexander Herbert and Brian Gigantino. That is the work of Christy Ironside on the Soviet ruble, which is a well-written research study, but accepts the familiar narrative of the inevitable decline and fall of the ruble as if like we should just move on, nothing to learn from here except inevitable failure. And this narrative of failure becomes even more problematic in her review of Jeremy Friedman's book, Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World, where she defines the fall both of PKI of Indonesia and of Salvador Allende's presidency in Chile as failures of socialism, never mentioning the fact that the United States, in fact, engineered and supported military coups in both countries. Another example would be Karl Schlöger's The Soviet Century, Archaeology of a Lost World, celebrated at length in the press, which is also well-written and research analysis of Soviet everyday life, but again, completely apolitical, and positions the USSR as the lost world, worthy perhaps of nostalgia, but containing no lessons for the future. Before this talk, I talked to some of my colleagues who are left history activist for whom the legacy of the Cold War radicalism remains important and needs to be taught to the younger generations. And I think that's one thing that Black Sheep could do. They could provide a way to cross a real generational gap in understanding the level of repression of radicalism during decolonization and the Cold War versus today, which is also exists, but is kind of hidden from contemporary discourse. And in other circles, there's a tendency to think of socialism in a national context only, rather than thinking across national and regional borders. And Soviet legacy, I think, is especially important for teaching coalition building across lines of race, as well as thinking beyond nation and along north-south rather than east-west axis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. Okay, we are actually making great time, which is extremely unusual for leftists, as any of you who have been to a leftist meeting should know. Our final speaker is Masha Salazkina. She teaches film and media studies at Concordia University in Montreal. She is the author of In Excess, Sergei Eisenstein's Mexico, as well as World Socialist Cinema, Alliances, Affinities, and Solidarities in the Global Cold War. And forthcoming this summer, Romancing Yesenia, How a Mexican Melodrama Shaped Global Popular Culture. Okay, Masha, please go ahead.
Thank you. My friends, colleagues, and comrades have said some of the things that I also wanted to mention. So I'm actually going to focus on the effort to take back discourses and practices of decolonization from anti-leftist perspectives, and the way that they're currently used to further entrench or re-entrench Cold War discourses and epistemologies within the field. I think there's, it will not surprise anyone that there was a lot of, in addition to the article in the Left East that has already been mentioned here, there have been a lot of pushback from within the leftist groups. Again, the notion of decolonization, again, for good reasons, because again, it's very obvious how it has been used within our field in particular as a way to, again, re-entrench both the paradoxically, the exceptionalist discourses about either Russia or Soviet Union or the region, or just to, again, reformulate some of the familiar Cold War perspectives. But what I really would like to agitate everyone to do is actually to, again, take back the issue of decolonization as crucial for our discipline and for thinking about any kind of political struggle today, because certainly I think colonial and new imperialist structures form absolutely integral part of contemporary field of political struggle and need to be interrogated rather than just sort of be left for the reactionary or liberal actors and scholars to appropriate. And of course, as a lot of you know, my own position as an entrenched internationalist is also very much part of my own history, personal and intellectual history of politicization, because my first experience of really coming to terms with myself as a political subject and a leftist actually took place certainly not in the Soviet Union, where I grew up as a child, and not in the United States, where I came as an undergraduate, but in Mexico, where I studied as part of my undergraduate degree, and where I was part of intellectual circles as an undergrad, where leftist, Marxist, and internationalist perspectives were, in fact, cultural hegemony. And this was the first time where I was encountered and actually had to be confronted with my own in completely not developed and articulate, but clearly liberal views, as of course have been so many of those of us of the last Soviet or first post-Soviet generation. And then this perspective, when I came to be a graduate student at Yale, was further developed and, let's say, concretized by the actual experience of student unionization. Shout out to all of my old GSO friends here, and many of those whom I don't know, but we're all in it. And this was a crucial experience. So this was a way to really link the concrete political struggles that were going on within the US Academy to those questions of politics and the relationship between who we are as academics, as scholars, and our actual practices. And then furthered actually by this increasing sense that I was getting as being a member, a graduate student in the Slavic department, of absolute intellectual isolation from theory at large. And I have to admit that I joined the Marxist reading group that Michael Denning and John McKay were running, in part out of the general desire to break out of the intellectual theoretical ghettoization or isolation of Slavics. And ironically, that was really a motivating force for me at the time, which really meant embracing largely Euro-American or Anglo-European tradition of Marxism, and cultural criticism and cultural studies. And it's actually only when I left the beloved field of Slavic entirely that I have come to progressively articulate for myself the importance of actually resisting the Eurocentrism of many of the theoretical and methodological frameworks with which we operate. And that has become since then a very important part of my identity as a scholar and as a political being. So a lot has been said already here about the need to look at the legacies of the historical legacies of anti-imperialist thought and anti-colonial thought beyond the, again, sort of Euro-American tradition. And I would like to add to that equally important, I think, is for all of us to really interrogate and change our points of reference in terms of our citational practices and really what we think of as to-go-to theory, and really turn our attention as intellectual and political interlocutors to the writings that are done both historically and in contemporary terms in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I am not here talking about transnational or comparativist work, which of course is what I do, but that is, let's say, a very specific object of research for me. I'm talking about shifting against citational practices and what we think of as the theoretical and methodological framework, because we all, without much reflection, do turn to, let's say, Western Marxists or other theorists as theory. And instead, what I would say is that for so many of us, due to the shared global condition of both the combined and uneven development and post-socialism, which is indeed a global condition, that it is actually the contemporary scholarship, Marxist or post-Marxist, that comes out of, again, both situated in or directed towards Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that can really provide very important intellectual insights, both for our site-specific work, whether it is or is not transnational itself. But also, I should say, without this epistemological shift, I believe that internationalist solidarity that we talk about is at best skin deep. And so to this, I should also add that I think critical perspectives on indigeneity and critical migration studies, which right now certainly constitute crucial global sites of struggle for so many of us, and yet nonetheless remain very much outside of the purview of much of the scholarship in our area, or else at best left to liberal or Cold War perspectives, is another uncomfortable uncomfortable and yet crucial area to really look at, again, both in terms of, in this case, the objects of research that we're thinking about, but also, again, theoretical critical perspectives that come out in that field, which I think really are the only ways that we can really think of in practice and in theory, in production of knowledge of internationalist solidarity. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Masha. That was wonderful. And thank you to all of our panelists. This was a really fascinating mix of ideas and suggestions and reflections. So I want to invite the audience to talk and give questions and comments, suggestions of their own. Of course, we have a wonderful 118 participants at the moment, which is really remarkable, and I think almost double what we anticipated. So what we have to do, of course, is moderate this discussion in some way. So I would ask that if you want to speak, you raise your hand, not physically, but using the Zoom function. For those of you who are maybe not aware how to do this, there should be a button called Reactions at the bottom of your screen. It should have a little smiley face. If you click on that, it'll bring down a drop-down menu, which has a raise hand function on it. It'll have a little hand. And so just do that, and it orders everyone here so I can call on you in a wonderful and ordered way. Okay, so please, any comments or suggestions for the panel? Our hope is that organically we'll shift eventually from discussion of the panel and these suggestions towards more kind of wholesome discussions holistic discussions of the future of BSS, of the left in the field, and so on. Yes, Kirill, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you to all panelists, and of course, I largely agree with a lot of points. But I wanted to commenting on Rossen's remarks actually, and to rehearse to repeat the conversation that Rossen and I actually had in the Messenger a couple of days back. So I'm currently teaching in the United States. I teach Russian literature. I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I come from Russia, and Rossen and I have actually studied together in Moscow, and I even come from the intelligentsia that Rossen is criticizing. And basing on my experience of becoming a member of the US academic left, I would want to emphasize a slightly different perspectives on the Russian and the Soviet experience that come with it, right? So within the American academia, and so I would basically be talking now as a member of the Russian anti-fascist immigration rather than American academic, with the difference being that obviously in American academia, our focus is left academia, our focus is on the critique of Cold War narratives and the kind of reactionary Soviet intelligentsia, post-Soviet intelligentsia narratives that Rossen emphasized. At the same time, as a exiled Russian, my central concern for me is the reemergence of Russian fascism, not just a geopolitical threat, even though it is like I experience it as world-threatening, but also as an obvious opponent, right, as an obvious enemy for any kind of left-wing thought. So this is, for me, this is the priority, right? What do we do with the emergent Russian fascism, with Putinism? And within that framework, what is central to me, again, as a Russian, is the way that the revival of Stalinism is a core element of this threat, right? And of course, there is a conversation to be had about how this is done in capitalist conditions. But again, from within the Russian perspective, this the danger of Stalinism and the revival of Stalinism is what we are dealing with and what we are fighting against. And in this perspective, a particular kind of discourses associated with the Russian liberal intelligentsia, which are focused on the memory of the victims, the revival, the memorial, specifically the memorial problematic, the revival of the victims, the memory of all crimes committed by Stalinism on the territory of the Soviet Union, seems like a crucial element for what we could be focusing on, among other things that were said today. And I'm not authorized to speak for Ukrainians, but from my understanding of debates within the Ukrainian community, this is another important issue, that the crimes committed by Stalinism within the Soviet Ukraine are not should be acknowledged, along with the role that the socialism has played in the formation of Ukrainian identity and the cultural revival of the 1920s. So I would just emphasize again, identifying as a Russian left-wing person, right? I would emphasize the centrality of those topics as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Kirill. Other thoughts? Anna, please.
Hello, can you, oh, oops. Hi, I'm Anna. I am a graduate student, PhD student at the University of Virginia, Department of Slavic Languages and Literature. So I'm from that discipline. Thank you so much for this circle and for your presentations. And Kirill Oskovat, thank you a lot for your take. I would like to also express this kind of concern of the same vein as Kirill. I, particularly as a person of non-Russian, non-Slavic descent who is from Russia, I am Sakha and Buryat, and whenever we discuss, I noticed among leftist circles, in particularly the Russophone leftist circles, whenever we discuss issues of liberal democracies, liberal reforms, everything like our critique of liberalism, one of the problems that arises a lot of times is that Russophone leftists often become overly concerned with the rise of ethno-nationalisms, particularly what they call romantic ethno-nationalism. And I, myself as a leftist, I absolutely am aware of it, and especially in the national republics of the Russian Federation in the 90s, the rise of romantic ethno-nationalism was definitely a concern. And there are still, like, I am a decolonial activist, and I have to engage a lot with the old 1990s era intelligentsia from national republics who are very ethno-nationalist, and it is not great a lot of the times. But then at the same time, I feel like there is this very Stalinist problem within Russophone leftist circles that often arises when they don't see the difference between actual ethno-nationalism and the politicization of indigenous peoples and their place-based identities, rather than their what they consider like their identity politics. So I also would like to emphasize that I became a little bit concerned when I saw the aforementioned article in the Leftist. I became very concerned with the fact that there's such an overlook of the fact that there is a huge like the fact that Stalinist ethnography at first, Stalinist national politics, they actually still present a huge problem and obstacle for I guess multinational solidarity across and leftist solidarity, because you cannot completely erase people's claims to their land, people's claims to their environment. I mean, there are protests going on in Bashkortostan that are being described as ethno-nationalist by the Kremlin, but they're not ethno-nationalists anyway. They're very political. They're very environmentally. They're indigenous people fighting for their environmental rights in the same vein as did Standing Rock, for example, North Dakota. So anyway, I just wanted to also like back Kirill Oskovat's concern, and that we should really be critical of Stalinism, and we should really emphasize that we are not in any ways are going to I guess be nostalgic for Stalinism or for Stalin. And we also should be aware that Stalinist narratives are very that are ubiquitous. It's sometimes even so difficult to even identify them 100%. So we should be always aware of it, just for the sake of solidarity that is not just Moscow and St. Petersburg centric or like Eurocentric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, Jennifer, please.
Hi, thanks everyone. Mine's just a super quick, yes, I don't mean to derail this conversation, so if other people had comments on that, but I just was curious. I loved the idea, Masha, of changing citational practices, and I'm wondering if there would be any interest in having like a shared Google Doc of readings, theoretical in particular, that we could sort of build our collective knowledge with. So I wonder if there's any interest in doing that. Thanks.
I would definitely be interested, for sure. Yeah. Anya.
This is actually on a very related note, also related to Masha's call to shift our citational practices. And it's a more pragmatic, practical question about this. I work on a combination of Eastern European and Russian cinema together with East Asian cinema, actually. And one critique that I get in both fields as I straddle them is, well, you need to make sure that the things that you cite make logical sense in terms of their inheritance, their intellectual inheritance through time. And I feel like that is the #1 challenge that I come across, is showing, well, look, even though this was occurring in a different country, I see the analogous movement, and I would like to talk about it here vis-a-vis these two nations. So for example, Russia and Japan, and Soviet Union and Japan. So I would love to hear if you have, if at the top of your mind, any notable specific example where you justified this and were able to deflect that kind of criticism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Katya, please.
Sorry. Yeah, I have a related question. I'm also super interested about both changing citation practices and sort of cultivating some sort of an internationalist archive. I was really inspired by Ilya's idea of trying to bring theory and history closer together as they're often presented as animus. And I've also heard some lovely discussion groups or reading groups mentioned. So I think like I would love to be informed of any sort of, I don't know, existing infrastructure or collaborate in creating an infrastructure that would sort of help facilitate the creation of that archive.
Thank you so much. Okay. Masha, please go ahead.
I would, if there are more questions or comments from the group in general, I'd be happy to let people go first and then maybe collect them and respond. But if there aren't, just quickly, I mean, I think there is the kind of concerns that Anya expressed about gatekeeping, which really is largely what it is, gatekeeping that comes especially from all area studies, right? And so there's a resistance, equal resistance on the side of, let's say, East Asian area studies to like make sure that the exceptionalism that I really have come to think of, like area studies, is almost inevitably developing the discourse of their own exceptionalism, right? Isn't disrupted in ways that, you know, that you really have to fight for. And that's why I think, you know, I maybe didn't express myself quite adequately by just saying changing citational practices, right? But actually interrogating and working through texts that are on different national contexts, actually especially outside that do not correspond to your object of study. And I realize that this is a big ask, right? You know, but it's something that I have come to do. And I also realize that now, as you know, a tenured, you know, fully paid, a faculty member, it's much easier for me to do. I can take the extra time that it certainly does take to work through, let's say, theoretical writings that, are actually centering on, let's say, India or, East Asia. That does take extra work, but I think reading groups are very good for that. So back to Jenny's question, I think, in addition to, I'm not sure that just, a bank of articles will do that because, I mean, Anya is right, just like citing an article is not going to convince anyone, right? But I think reading groups might, in fact, as well as conferences that are where you bring together people working on a similar theoretical problem, like we've tried to do that. Some of you were here, who are here, were part of it with the post-socialist seminar that was organized out of Berkeley. So these kinds of much more engaged attempts to both interrogate the particular frameworks from other, again, areas, and then as a result, be able to articulate precisely, because, like there's no ready-made answer for Anya's question, right, that I have already come to develop, right? But developing your own explanation, because it is true, like it's something that you will have to defend and you have to really articulating both the differences and the similarities, right? But I think reading groups are really a great space for that. I am, for example, part of a group on gender media in development, where I am the only person from, let's say, the former socialist bloc, other than one of my colleagues who works on China. Otherwise, it is really dominated by Latin Americanists and South Asianists, with a handful of Africanists, right? But so being an active interlocutor, right, where we bring our own work on our own regions, right, but trying to really look at what are the shared theoretical, scholarly, or otherwise texts that we can integrate. So, and I really do think that Black Sheep can really think of setting up, depending on people's specific sets of expertise, those kinds of reading groups, which then would help develop a broader vocabulary. Rather, I mean, I'm happy to try to share the reading lists, etc. But I really do think that it takes active working through the text, and often together with scholars, or even it doesn't matter, young scholars, more experienced scholars, but yeah, that have the mastery of languages, that have a deeper, thicker knowledge of the cultural context, right? But be able to work through this. Again, even if your own work is not comparativist, but in order to change, again, some of these epistemological perspectives, whether it's on, like, very simple examples like the public sphere, right? And then, we're like, oh, well, the public sphere doesn't apply to us. Well, yeah, no, but there are like scholars, let's say in India, who've been working on this question, for a very long time, right? And so those, that's what I'm proposing. And I would really like to hope that the Black Sheep can be the space to allow for some of those sites for actual engaged discussions, whether through reading groups or through conferences or other exchanges.
Thanks so much, Masha. Rossen, if it's okay with you, I'll prioritize the audience. Yeah. So Evidiu, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, but please go ahead.
Hi everybody. I don't know if you can see me. So great to see this initiative, and of course I would love to see this conversation rise up and take a very different kind of amplitude. So I'm very positive about this initiative, yet as let's say as an outsider, I don't want to seem like throwing a wrench into the works, but I would like to ask two questions. One, the Black Sheep initiative, I want to understand better understand if the Black Sheep initiative isn't looking more to, in its logic of separation from the liberal and conservative tendencies of entrenchment of the Russian East European area studies, if it's simply trying to move towards those marginalized, uncomfortable areas that are that the entrenched direction of this area studies is marginalizing and making visible, or if it intends doing an epistemic move, which in the manner, for instance, in the colonial thought challenge not only coloniality in itself, but also entrenched form of post-colonial discourse. So that if Black Sheep intends to do an epistemic move that challenges the area studies in itself as an epistemic product or made in USA, therefore including criticism of the US empire, your own work as cultural workers and academics, most of you based in the US. That's the first question. The second question is along the same lines, but as again from the outside, as an independent academic, if you see this Black Sheep as this initiative that is opening, right? This area studies, if you see this form of reorganizing the discipline also as a way of increasing the power of speaking outside the discipline, not necessarily to the public sphere, but rethinking the ways of building narratives outside the academia, outside the, let's say, methodological nationalism of each one. Thank you.
Thank you for those super productive questions. Yeah, Rossen, please go ahead.
So, I mean, first to thank Anya and Kirill for their questions, and very important and challenging questions, actually. But I would still suggest that there's really much less difference between our positions and much less of a debate. I mean, maybe speaking specifically for myself, I would be the first one to very gleefully throw a stone at Stalinism, which can be, very legitimately blamed not only for destruction of much of the left within the Soviet Union and even without, but also for a kind of a revision to nationalities policies that place the Russian people as the first people of the Soviet Union, something that would have been unthinkable of the 1920s, but that was Stalin's toast in 1945. So to me, really, there's not that much of an argument here, but I would still, try to distinguish my critique of Stalinism with the kind of critique of Stalinism that I was exposed to within the walls of the RGU, the Russian State University for the Humanities, which is not as something historically specific, but as a kind of a metaphysic that was permeating, that was transhistorical, permeating contemporary Russian society, and in a way that saw most of the Russian population sometimes as latent Stalinists, and so and any critique of capitalism is an expression of Stalinism. So that I think it's very important to be historically specific in thinking of Stalinism, and not to, for example, to call the very far right Putinist regime that we have in any way Stalinist, because the socioeconomics, the social formations are so radically different than they are now. Certainly, a cultural memory of Stalinism is being redeployed, but again, immense objective material differences between today's Russians and the Russia of 1930s and 40s. And to Anya, yes, I would absolutely absolutely agree that we need, within the Black Sheep, but also within the left, need to be extremely attentive to the nationalities dynamics within contemporary Russia as well, and certainly, you know, the contemporary Putinist regime, you know, has been fostering, you know, has been laying the grounds of the kind of ethnic conflict that by you know, through its Russian world logic, through also often completely ignoring the fact that Russia is a multinational society, and so we should yes, be very watchful for both processes taking place in the non-Russian, non-ethnically Russian communities of the Russian Federation, but also you know, not in any way to reproduce a kind of a Russia first logic. And to Video, just one final word. Thank you, Video, and I would really love it if you spearhead, you know, some of our initiatives on rethinking those epistemologies of coloniality and post-coloniality.
Thank you, Rossen. I'll just say too, I don't have a full comprehensive answer to Vidya's wonderful questions either, but I will say a little bit more about the Black Sheep Society itself, as I think that a lot of people are probably curious about this. So we formed recently around the last ACES conference in Philadelphia, and we had met beforehand. You know, a few of us gathered who were been talked casually about doing this, and you know, we discussed what the organization would be, what kind of scope would it have, what would be its activities. And in kind of typical leftist fashion, we did not agree on basically a single thing, in that we couldn't agree on a single word of the name. So we talked about, is it going to be, you know, socialist, post-socialist? Well, you know, that excludes people who do the 19th century or something, right? You know, is it regional? Well, you know, socialism, which is just in the region. Are we primarily a North American-based organization? Are we for everyone, you know, in the world who studies this thing? Are we primarily for academics, or are we also trying to engage, you know, intellectuals of broader stripes? And in the end, we kind of settled to leave those questions open and to organically evolve in the direction that our membership took us, and to try and have the most kind of open and inclusive mission that we could. I think, correct me, anyone else in the steering committee can correct me if I'm wrong here. But so in terms of like what is our, you know, kind of main goal, I would say that the main thing is to give a forum and a voice for leftist discussion in the field, right? It's to bring us together to have conversations like these where, you know, leftists can get into wonderful argumentative debates among leftists, right? And not have to kind of continually talk to people who are speaking in a very different mode, who are speaking in a very different understanding that isn't going to lead to something productive necessarily. Not to say that you can't have productive conversations with liberals, but you're getting what I'm saying, right? That the left needs its own space to talk to each other about things, and that is our primary goal. So for me personally, I would love to see, you know, a few years from now that the lefties hold, that the Black Sheep holds its own conferences. I think that would be great to kind of fully develop into an academic organization which is also open to you know, public intellectuals of any sort, right? But also, I think it'd be really wonderful to make the kind of epistemic interventions that you're talking about, where we're actually, you know, kind of producing intellectual thought that is making broad claims on the field itself that we are doing in some sort of collective fashion, whatever that is. Right now, we have pretty limited capacity. Obviously, we've just started, but we're hoping to do, you know, as much as we can. So please suggest any kind of events, activities, whatever we could do, and we would love to do them, yeah, or discuss them. Sopo, you have a question. Good to see you here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sopo Japaridze. I'm a co-host of Reimagining Soviet Georgia. It's a podcast that focuses on to reimagine the socialist past. So I would like to just say a quick word about this boogeyman Stalinism that has been brought up, because as a Georgian and as someone who actually tries to look at Georgia and the role of Georgia in the Soviet Union, it's really important that we do not have this idea that somehow everything is up for debate besides some boogeyman Stalinism. So there is no verdict on what that means. And I don't think it should be used to scapegoat Russian nationalism by a Georgian, if you want to get really nationalist here. So I would say let's actually discover what that actually means. Everything should be up for grabs. Everything should be looked upon with fresh eyes. And let's not go back into these sort of, already, parameters around what you can and cannot question, it's a sort of religious kind of cult that it's like you can't say anything about Stalin and you can't actually have a nuanced discussion. Somehow you're going to be, giving, arms to Putin or something by doing that. So that was my contribution to this. I'm sorry I was late, but I'm very happy to see all of you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sopo. And I'll also recommend her podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia, for anyone who's interested. They've been interviewing a lot of great people in the field, leftists of all varieties. It's a really wonderful resource. Yeah. Others, please. By the way, we budgeted time for this to be an hour and a half from the start of the meeting, so we have about 20 minutes left. That makes sense. So please, questions as they come or comments. And feel free, if you don't want to just talk about what the panelists said, if you have your own ideas that didn't necessarily come up, those are totally welcome. Kirill, please.
Yes, I love the conversation about Stalinism. I appreciate the different responses, and I absolutely agree that we should actually talk about Stalinism more rather than less, right? I feel that it's something that is somehow swept under the rug, and obviously different catchwords can be problematic, right? So I'll just explain what I mean by that. And so there is obviously the point that Rossen made that current revival in Stalinism, the current Russian fascism is superficial, that it is a different socioeconomic problematic. But again, and that is definitely true, but I'm thinking about the kind of the Marxist, right? The history repeat itself, but not identically, right? So we have the photographs of books about Stalin, like whole shelves about Stalin from Russia Today, right? Like literally that was in my Facebook feed yesterday. So what do we do with that, right? But that is sort of on the level of ideology, superstructure, if you will. And what is the basis to say for us to speak about Stalinism as present, as practice in today's Russia's today fascism, right? And that is the institution of the prison, right? The continuity of the prison system of what was Gulag and now is called FSIN, but this is something that was the basic institution in which some of the very important intelligentsia efforts, Memorial specifically, I'm specifically referring to that organization, of combating the proto-Putinism, the Putinism, and the fascist, recent fascist regime has been focused, right? The organizational continuity of Russian prison system has the material basis, right, for this revival of a Stalinist ideological superstructure, again, under the conditions of global capitalism, which of course makes it a very complicated phenomenon. But this is me trying to just kind of define the terms in which I think the conversation about Stalinism is relevant, needs to be carried on, as some of us already said. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kirill. Yeah, we should have a little a button that goes off for every time we get a counter for Stalin's name. Okay, Dr. Chakrabarty, please. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yeah.
Yeah. I apologize for having missed the first part of the discussions because there was something in the university. But if I may, because you kindly allowed us to raise other issues other than the ones discussed in the panel. So, I mean, what interests me, what has been interesting me in the last few years are alternative socialist discourses. Now, I am beginning to study Indo-Yugoslav cultural diplomacy in the Cold War, and through that pathway, I've been reading a lot and working also in the archives in Serbia, in Belgrade, on Yugoslav archives. And one of the things that strikes me a lot, and the experienced historians and archival experts would forgive me, maybe this sounds a bit superficial, but one of the impressions I get from the correspondences between the Yugoslav and Indian professors, academics, cultural professionals, government servants, ideologues, is that already in the beginning of the Cold War, there was an attempt, especially in the so-called Global South. This has become a very fashionable phrase of late. So in the so-called Global South, about alternative pathways to socialism, alternative sort of approaches to socialism. Now I'm wondering if the Black Sheep Society would also be interested in following quote-unquote non-mainstream, quote-unquote syncretic socialist approaches, as for example, maybe the Yugoslav way. I mean, there are lots of interesting permutations and combinations in socialist discourses in Africa, Asia, Afrasia, Afro-Eurasia. So I was wondering if that would be a major concern of the Black Sheep Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll let other members respond as needed, but it's a wonderful question. Thank you. Dom, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you especially, Dr. Chakrabarty, for that last comment, because I want to just speak a little bit about Yugoslavia as a good example of the kind of concrete retrieval of different perspectives, not just in terms of methodological speculation, although I am fully in favor of methodological critique and speculation, but also in terms of the bringing to light concrete histories of political practice, of cultural creation, of intellectual work that exist fully within, at least on principle, on paper, exist fully within the field of Russian, East European, Eurasian, Slavic, etc. studies, right? I mean, Yugoslavia, it's right there in the name. And yet there's, the kind of sort of easy, reductive, automatic, liberal account of the Cold War that I think we're all far too familiar with and kind of frustrated with is one that really has no place for Yugoslavia, right? If you want to talk about a critique of Stalinism from the left, for that matter, and a critique that, again, is not just limited to paper, but that was put into practice as a concrete political project, and even a state political project, but also very much an internationalist one via the non-aligned movement, then, and, your comments about Yugoslav-Indian conversations at the start of the Cold War and collaboration is obviously germane there, then Yugoslavia is right there. So I think, Yugoslavia is by no means sort of should be seen as the privileged or only example, but certainly is a very significant case in point for the kinds of the work of political, historical, and intellectual retrieval that I think many of us are interested in. And I should say also that there is a newly formed, but long in the making, New Yugoslav Studies Association, which is not the same thing as the Black Sheep Society, but obviously, far from everyone who might want to be involved in BSS works on Yugoslavia, and also, the Yugoslav Studies Association has its own kind of formation, but there are certainly points of productive overlap. So for anyone who is interested in that, first of all, Georgia Popovic, who is here on this call, has been at the center of organizing it. And yes, I was just about to refer to the website, but Georgia has put it in the comments section right now. So I wanted to put that on the table as we're talking about all of this.
Thank you so much, Dom. Yeah. Elena, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to respond to the call for alternative socialisms. Definitely, that's why I would be interested mostly in the work of Black Sheep Society, because not only we should think about sort of different versions in Eastern European socialism, but of course China is a big player in thinking about socialism. And then in some countries there were several different parties in several different directions of thinking, both socialist theory and socialist practice, such as Indonesia, several African countries, like Lusophone, anti-colonial African movements had several directions that could be explored. And of course, I also believe that not only that looking at these ACES areas will help the discipline to think about its own kind of where it stands in the whole in the map of socialism in the Cold War or before or in the 19th century even possibly. And then I also wanted to respond to the ethno-nationalist question. I think I really would be interested in, I'm definitely not arguing for condemning ethno-nationalist approaches to history or theory. I would just caution against applying identity politics in Western contexts to colonial practices and theories that emerged in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe, because in the United States, racial difference is defined by one-drop rule legally since the late 19th century, and identity politics as a result tends to emphasize racial difference over economic origins of racism and racialization. So we really need to be careful in applying North American theories to ACES context. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Masha, if it's okay, I'll prioritize the David over you. David, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Just a comment, because, you know, the prospect of having Black Sheep Society be some kind of broader conference academic network discussing these things, you know, I think is really, really exciting. And, you know, hearing these discussions about Stalinism, question of Leninism hasn't come up. But I mean, you know, I grew up in a time where, you know, right before me, like I grew up, you know, into a world where the big discussions on the left were still between Stalinists who were still around, you know, and then those Leninists who were trying to defend that legacy against the Stalinists, right, and against and the anti-communist socialists. But everything was revolved around those kind of questions about the Soviet Union, about the Soviet bloc. And, you know, there hasn't been a forum to discuss these issues with, you know, in the context of a new generation, not just among new generation of people, but, you know, a world in which that state socialism doesn't exist, in which we're dealing with Putinism, which many still outside of us, right, connect with the Soviet legacy, you know. And I think, you know, it's really interesting. Like, you know, we live in a very peculiar time, one can say, in which in this day and age, there are fascists on the political scene, but there aren't any communists for the most part, right? And you know, and that's why what I also see. I wrote something about this recently, you know, about this kind of attraction on the part of some leftists criticizing the new right, who were kind of going back, thinking they're going back to some kind of Leninist legacy, you know, a legacy which I challenge from a left perspective and always have, you know, but you know, but think that kind of discussion, again, with a new generation in a new context, can really be something that elicits some great new conclusions and a great new kind of leftist practice as well. So, you know, yeah, I just wanted to put my word in for those kinds of discussions that we continue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Masha.
Just as a quick response to Gautam and also to Elena, and actually on the subject of the Yugoslav group, I have a very just direct proposal alongside what Dominic was talking about. I think I would certainly be happy to join forces with, as part of the Yugoslav group, they're actually right now some of the most prominent scholars of the non-aligned movement from within the Yugoslav perspective, right? And I'm sure they would be delighted to have a reading group that actually looks at the non-aligned movement, not just from the perspective of Yugoslav studies, but actually looking at the bibliography around this. And I have to say, as a couple of people here also had this experience. I am currently part of one reading group of non-aligned movement, where I have a feeling that vast majority of the people have actually no interest in non-aligned movement, other than precisely the handful of my Yugoslav scholar colleagues, right? So I think actually they themselves would be delighted to set up a group where people actually want to precisely interrogate questions of alternative socialism and read scholarship from the different regional perspectives on socialism as part of non-aligned movement, and what are these alternative movements, right? Because otherwise, this revival that is certainly taking place of these questions still tends to be very regionally or locally situated, which is normal, right? But this would be a way to actually bring together people with perspective. So I would be, I don't know, Georgie, or, we can talk about actually setting up something like that if there's even modest interest, because I think there are definitely people both in this group and in the Yugoslav group that would really be very happy to do that. And we even have, like, for that, I actually already have a bibliography for at least, like, first, I don't know, 5 meetings together.
Thank you, Masha. We have a couple minutes left. Final closing thoughts, suggestions, comments, bitter attacks from anyone. Rossen, please.
Just maybe amplifying your call, if any of you have any practical suggestions for sorry, I keep on saying lefties because some of us here on the Zoom call are also on the editorial board of lefties, but I'm speaking about Black Sheep, and if any of you have any practical suggestions for things that Black Sheep could do, or even better, for ideas that you can try to spearhead and materialize, and because we really this is hopefully we'll have a few more of these Zoom events, but this is also our opportunity to get your ideas, and if you have especially energies to put into them as well, that would be even better.
Okay, thank you, Rossen. So I think I'll wrap this up. Thank you all for this really wonderful discussion and for coming out today. I was really amazed to see all of you and how active this discussion was. I've never seen such an active Zoom chat. If only my students had been that active during COVID. It's been really great to see you, and thank you to all of our panelists. It was really wonderful. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. And just to advertise our next 2 events to you, please correct me if I'm wrong about the dates, but on April 5th, I believe at the same time, we'll be having a similar roundtable panel, but this time with veterans of left in the field. We come from a long tradition of socialist interlocutors in and who study the region, which will be giving us their own personal reflections and thoughts about the field over decades of their commentary in it. And then on May 3rd, which is also a Friday at the same time, we'll have another roundtable on labor organizing in the field. Both of these, the guest list for those will be or the panelists will be announced, and all the further information. Please kindly share these things on Facebook, send to your friends. This is the most helpful thing you can do for us at this stage, is to get the word out about us, and to please come and bring your questions, comments, and so on. Thank you all so much. This has been really wonderful. Thanks. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Renny, for making this run so smoothly.
Thank you. Yeah. And please do join up on our Facebook group. Thank you. Join up on our Facebook group, and on the in the intake form, you can get into our listserv as well by email. Okay.
Thank you, Renny, for the heroic task of chairing. And
Sure.
thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Ross and Ilya. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
I'm adding my thanks as well, and I want to thank the 30 people who have signed up for our listserv since this meeting began. Thank you.
That's great.
Yes, everybody, keep it up.
Thank you so much, Rossen, and the other organizers. It was really very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. Okay.
We can stop the recording, I think, now.
Yes, thank you.